Hey, everybody, it's San Feng Lim here, and this is the first, the number one of 6 of our speaker series. And today we have James Mendez Hodes here to talk to us all about cultural consulting. Let me just do a brief intro here. James is an ENnie Award-winning writer, game designer, and cultural consultant. You might know his works from Avatar Legends, on which we worked together, Thousand Arrows, or Scion. And he did a lot of cultural consulting for Frosthaven, Magic the Gathering, or even the Jackbox Party Packs. He also did Juncture with me, which is great.
Yeah.
He did writings about orcs and racism. And he is a graduate from Swarthmore College and a major in religion, minors in dance and English lit. He also received his master's in Eastern Classics from St. John's. And he has interests in martial arts, hip hop, poetry, and sumo wrestling. And a lot of those are actually the same thing when you think about it, right?
Yes,
Hip hop
definitely
is
exactly the
poetry,
same thing.
wrestling is a martial art.
Yes.
And he primarily plays a tank. Secondarily, he's a support.
Yes.
And I'm going to leave it
In
over
my
for
real
James right
life.
now. James, you are going to give us a talk about cultural consultation. So just for people out there watching, if you have questions, type them into the chat. We're going to have a Q&A at the end, probably in about 30 to 40 minutes. And I'll get all those over to James at that time. All right, so take it away, James.
Cool. Sen, thank you so much for the intro. I feel very appreciated and man, I don't know. Like, I gotta tell people to like stop listing my accolades ahead of time because then I have to like live up to them. I wish there was some way to like adjust everyone's expectations low and then reveal that at the end, but that wouldn't be very practical. At any rate, hi, my name's James Mendez Hodes. I am a writer, a game designer, and a cultural consultant. As Sen mentioned, I'm going to touch on the first two topics, writing and game design, in terms of how they intersect with cultural consulting. But cultural consulting is going to be the main topic of this talk. So, a cultural consultant helps other creatives represent diverse and marginalized identities, especially in an authentic and positive manner in their work. This is, as the talk description mentioned, this is a fancy way of saying that people hire me to tell them that they are racist. But really, telling people that they're racist is only a small part of my job. I tell people that there are many kinds of offensive, but in addition to like the negative parts where I'm calling people out or I'm telling people what they're doing wrong, cultural consulting is actually a really positive additive process, and it involves a lot of design skills and a lot of narrative design and a lot of creativity, because my goal as a cultural consultant is never just to tell people hard to hear or negative things about themselves and their work. My goal as a cultural consultant is to make my clients' work better and stronger from a cultural perspective, and usually also from a writing or design or creative perspective, depending on what their medium of choice is. So I guess the first question I tend to get about my job as a cultural consultant after what is that is, how did I get here? So my own background, I'm Filipino American on my mom's side, and then I'm European Jewish on my dad's. I was raised Roman Catholic and with a lot of secular Jewish influences, although I wasn't raised in the religion. I went to Swarthmore College. I majored in religion, focusing on West African and Afro-Atlantic religion, so Voodoo, Candomblé, Lukumi, stuff like that. I also minored in dance, focusing on martial arts and on North Indian classical dance, Kathak specifically. And I learned a lot about Indian mythology and religion through that channel. And I also picked up an English lit minor focusing on poetry. I got really into poetry in high school, and then especially into hip hop because I really like structure and really complex rhyme schemes and forms and meters. So hip hop was sort of the perfect thing for me. Then I went to St. John's Graduate Institute for grad school, and I got a master's degree in Eastern classics. So that's great books of Japan, China, and India. St. John's is a great books program, so they only read primary sources. They don't read any secondary sources, which was fascinating and interesting. But as a cultural consultant, I got some issues with that approach because it was helpful in some ways, but also difficult in a lot of others. So I did all of this stuff because I wasn't a very strong student in college and grad school, and all of it was really fun and interesting for me, which made it easier. Uh, which made it easier for me to get the work done. But studying was kind of a struggle for me at first. Um, so I didn't really expect when I was studying any of this stuff that it was going to end up being such a huge part of my livelihood, or that I would end up using all elements of all of my degrees almost every single day of my work. So after I got out of grad school, I had no idea what I was going to do to make a living. And I bounced around between a bunch of different, not that great jobs. But on the weekends and in my free time, I was going to conventions and volunteering there and running games. And so after a few years of that, I started getting offers to write games myself, usually small pieces at first, but then bigger and bigger. And I noticed that a lot of the works that other people were hiring me to write were on cultural or religious topics that felt fraught or scary or intimidating to them. Things that they really wanted to make a game about, write a game about, but they didn't feel culturally competent to do so. So I ended up taking on a lot of those, many of them having to do with the expertises that I already talked about and the interests I already talked about. But then others of them having to do with cultures or groups or topics that neither I nor anybody else around me knew very well. So I had to develop a really good research process for those kinds of things. So I went full time as a game writer in 2016. And then over 2017 and 2018, the company I was working for collapsed, and I had a couple of years of extreme financial exigency as I struggled to find enough work in game design, whether as a writer or as a cultural consultant. And I don't want to like I'm here to encourage everybody who's watching and encourage everybody who wants to make this kind of work a big part of their life. But I do not want to undersell how scary those couple years were when I wasn't sure I was going to be able to make enough money, when freelancer taxes were hitting me really hard. Those were scary, bad years. And when people talk to me about going full time in game design or going full time with cultural consulting, I always tell them like even though I ended up in a good place here, a few years ago, I didn't really believe that this was a possible endpoint for me. So uh, that was kind of bad for a while. But in 2019, I think a lot of things changed for me slowly because I started blogging, and I wrote a couple of articles which you might have run across on the internet, which got me a lot of attention. One was called May I Play a Character of Another Race? And it was about how to play a role playing game as a character who isn't from a demographic that you're from in real life. And then the other one was called Orcs, Britons, and the Martial Race Myth. And it was a two article series about the racist underpinnings of orcs, the fantasy evil humanoids from J.R.R. Tolkien, who are now a mainstay of Warcraft and D&D and all types of fantasy media. So those articles got a lot of attention, a lot of controversy, and they drew a lot of attention to me. And I started getting a lot of offers from companies, both big and small, and individuals who were making games or podcasts, et cetera, et cetera. So since then, my cultural consulting business has kind of grown larger and larger, and my writing and design has shrunk, which honestly is kind of how I like it, because cultural consulting for me is energizing, but writing and design takes a lot of energy out of me, and it takes a huge amount of time, even for small jobs. So that's my whole background right now. Most of my cultural consulting work and income comes from a relatively small number of large companies, which give me reliable, large contracts on games that are going to go on for a long time. So I'd say Magic the Gathering is one of those, and then the Jackbox Party Packs probably also fit into that mold. But I also do a lot of small jobs and jobs at like lower rates with smaller scopes for smaller creators. Like uh, one of my favorite ones to talk about is a 17-year-old girl in high school who found me on Google and hired me to cultural consult on her fantasy novel that she wrote for fun in high school. And like I also wrote fantasy for fun in high school, but like mostly it was just for internet forums. I never thought about getting an editor, let alone a cultural consultant. So uh, I enjoy being able to see this part of the business from like so many different angles and perspectives. So let's see, what skills do you need to be a cultural consultant? So having some kind of cultural competency goes without saying. You do not necessarily have to be a cultural consultant about the identities that you have in real life, but it definitely does help. So, for example, I can talk about Filipino American identity. I can talk about being biracial. I can talk about growing up in a household with multiple different faith influences. But I don't know a huge amount about Philippine history. I know about specific times and places. Like I could tell you about the Philippine American War because I did a report on it in 7th grade, but I don't know a huge amount about like pre-colonial Philippine history. I know the mythology only moderately well. So if you needed a consultant on a Filipino topic, which was way back in the day, I might need to point you to another consultant, and that consultant might be Filipino, or they might actually be from outside the community, but someone who's studied that kind of thing in school, college, university, etc. So you do not necessarily need to have that identity, but I would definitely say that one of the rough parts of being a cultural consultant is that your real world identities are on the line at work. So if you get something wrong and you're working as like an accountant, no one was born an accountant. No one was assigned accountant at birth. So if you get something wrong, there's a degree to which you can set things aside and have some emotional remove from it. But if I'm consulting on a Filipino topic and I get something wrong about Filipinos, then I'm going to feel responsible, not just from a professional perspective, but also from a personal perspective, because I'll be thinking about my family, all my Filipino friends, all the Filipinos out there working in game design, and how they're going to feel about the thing that I got wrong. And I got to live with that. So that's scary to me. And I feel like I mostly get things right, but every day I'm afraid of like what's going to happen if I do get something wrong. Um, so if you are working on a certain topic, you do not necessarily have to be from the group that that topic is talking about. You could have expertise from another source. However, a lot of clients want you to be from that group for very good reasons, as well as some mercenary or bad ones. But it's something that clients are going to ask for. And if you're consulting on Filipino topics, for example, and you are not Filipino, people are going to probably ask you a lot more invasive and pressing and hardcore questions about how you came to this expertise and why they should hire you instead of trying to find a Filipino who has similar expertise. So I guess the takeaway from that is that your personal identity and the topics on which you are consulting both do and do not have a relationship. But yeah, it definitely helps from a connected to clients perspective if you are Filipino and you also have that expertise in Philippine history, for example. Aside from that, you need pretty good research skills. So I'm not going to go too deep into the details of research, but a lot of the time when I'm working, if I'm contracted to work on a certain topic and then I'm reading through it, I'd say about like 50% of the time, the comments that I end up giving to a client end up being on a realm that they didn't even hire me for. Sometimes that's outside the scope of my work, and I'll keep quiet on it on purpose. Other times, I'll just be reading through something where they hired me for X, and then I'll mention there's a couple of little things with X, but actually Y is the real major problem, and I think you really got to address that more. So, in order to gain that kind of fluency and competency where I can consult not only on my own wheelhouses but also on other things that tend to come up in the course of work, I need good research skills. I need to be able to look things up and to determine quickly whether a source that I'm reading sounds like it was well researched, sounds like it was coming from a perspective within a certain community, and especially I have to keep abreast of the way the bad guys and bad actors talk. And I need to know, especially if I see like a couple of differing viewpoints on a certain topic, I need to get a sense of how bad actors who are trying to subvert and derail conversations like to communicate so that I can identify those kinds of sources and deprioritize them in my research process. Let's see. Emotional labor is also a really big one. So in the course of doing cultural consulting, I give feedback to a client. Usually it's a combination of written and then verbal feedback. Some cultural consultants and sensitivity readers just do written write-ups, they just do notes. Other cultural consultants just do audio video feedback, or I guess did meetings back when we could have meetings face to face. From my personal perspective, I do much better in meetings, and I have a much easier time getting my point across and conveying it with a certain tone and not seeming hostile or aggressive or flip or whatever else it is I need to worry about them thinking I am that day. But ideally, I'm giving both written and verbal feedback. That's the most reliable way for me to do that. So the process of giving feedback involves a great deal of emotional labor, whether you're going to, regardless of what medium in which you're conveying it. So when I'm telling a client that they made something racist, I need to take care of their feelings, and I need to make them feel I need to make them feel emotionally comfortable and emotionally safe so they'll actually listen to the thing that I'm trying to get them to change. And this is really, really difficult from a bunch of different perspectives. So on one level, there's just the skills part of it where I need to cultivate that kindergarten teacher voice, and I need to imagine like I'm a kindergarten teacher and my client is a 5-year-old who just painted something on a wall, and I need to be able to tell them like, oh, hey, I love the beautiful house that you've painted there. What do you like about it? Oh yeah, the red roof, that's really cool. So that's wonderful, but also it's on the wall, so we're going to need to get rid of it and you're not allowed to come back here anymore. So I need to be able to convey a really harsh message in a way that my clients feel comfortable with. And often I don't have a huge amount of time to do that. And the person that I'm interacting with, usually most of the people who talk to me, they really want me to be there. They really want to be in the conversation. They're really glad that it's happening. And they're really grateful for the things that I'm saying to them, even the harsh things, especially the harsh things. But that's not always the case. And sometimes I'm working with a company where like they got 4 people in the meeting, 2 of them want me to be there, one of them's indifferent, and then one of them thinks that woke cancel culture is destroying the country, and I don't know, we should go back to colonial times or something. And sometimes I have to convey my point to that person also. So I have a whole series of rhetorical strategies and things which feel like tricks to me. I don't want to portray them as tricks because I'm not tricking anybody. I'm being honest with people. I'm just being the right kinds of honest. So I have a whole battery of techniques for taking my point, which I might feel really strongly and really intensely, and putting it in soft, gentle, easy to understand, easy to digest terms. This can be really rough and difficult, and also like if you're a certain kind of personality, if you have certain kinds of trauma that you're talking about and you're giving feedback on things which connect to things in your own life and your own history which hurt your heart really badly, this process can feel kind of like you're literally banging your own head against a wall. It can hurt. So that's something that I also do have to warn people about. Depending on your own temperament, the process of giving feedback on things which are traumatizing for you, for me, that feels cathartic and healing and uplifting, but that's because I'm lucky, and not everybody is in that position. So I always tell people when you're getting into this, tread lightly, do a little bit at a time, don't go full time in a single week, and watch your own emotional reactions and what the process of doing cultural consulting does to your own feelings and also to your own energy levels. Because for some people, it's going to take a lot out of you. For me, writing is harder than that. Writing is much scarier, but I still got to do that sometimes. Let's see. So yeah, aside from having to be nice to or take care of the feelings of people who might be doing messed up things, I think cultural consulting is also a creatively satisfying process for me because I hate working by myself. I like working with other people, and every cultural consultation is me working with somebody else, me helping somebody else do their thing. I'm not super invested in the idea of making something that's mine and have that be great and having my name be the main one on the marquee. Like that's cool and I'll enjoy that. But what I really look forward to professionally is helping other people take their thing and make their thing great. So helping someone else put their name up there and feel confident about their work and having them be grateful to me for that, that's the joy that I really personally chase. And then also the process of cultural consulting, as I mentioned before, it's additive and creative. So when I tell someone there's a certain problem with something, I want to be able to brainstorm solutions with them. So having skills of narrative design or game design or novel writing, whatever it is that you're working on, editing skills especially, editing skills are really broadly applicable within this kind of work. So all of those things are really, really relevant to the process because you don't just want to be telling people that they're wrong or bad and their stuff is wrong or bad. You want to be giving them action items and you want to leave them with positive things that they can do, that they can take into their own work. That will make them feel better about their work, not only from a cultural perspective, but also because it's a better game now. It's a better book. That character that you told them to change, the new version of that character, is actually cooler. And it's not that I never tell people to change things in a way that'll make them less fun. It happens every now and then. But I think that almost always I'm making the work better and cooler. Let's see. I want to talk about the pay for a moment. So freelancing is scary, and freelancer taxes in the United States, at least, are terrible. And also in the United States, here we don't have health insurance, so it's much easier. It's much more difficult to get into freelancing here in the U.S. and in other countries in similar situations than it might be in certain other places that I try not to think about because they make me feel bad about my country. So again, do not underestimate like how scary the financial aspects of this and the lack of benefits are going to be. I'm not saying you shouldn't have these jobs because of that. I just want people to be emotionally prepared for when freelancer taxes happen, and they're way more difficult than your taxes otherwise would be, and you have to pay way more even though it seems you're making way less, and it's awful. But aside from that, the model on which I work is I set an hourly rate, and then when a client gives me a job, I'll look over the materials and I'll quote them a number of hours I think it's going to take me, and then I'll quote them a rate which they're going to pay me per hour, and either they negotiate with me or they just say yes. Then they give me the work, I take time to review it, I write notes, and we do a video meeting to go over those notes. And then after that video meeting, which usually involves a good deal of brainstorming, the process repeats as many times as the client needs to get it to a final state. If there's topics within that which I don't feel comfortable consulting on myself, then I will reach out to another consultant, and I will either get the company to hire that consultant separately, or I'll subcontract to that consultant. And sometimes if the other consultant is not as experienced as a cultural consultant, then I'll kind of co-consult with them, and they'll offer expertise from a cultural perspective, and I'll offer expertise from a having done a lot of cultural consulting perspective. Honestly, that was kind of the situation I was in when Sen asked me to do cultural consulting on Jiangshi Blood in the Banquet Hall. So I was like, but Sen, you and Barb are Chinese and I'm not. Are you sure that? And Sen and Barb were like, yeah, it's fine. We just want you to do the cultural consulting stuff, and we can explain the Chinese stuff to you. And I was like, great, awesome. And it was a wonderful experience. Please, vote for us for an ENnie. And yeah, it went really well. Another time, I was a cultural consultant on Agon by Evil Hat Productions, and on that one I was consulting on Greek culture, which was fascinating because I did not know anything about Greek culture that was more recent than translating the Iliad. So I co-worked with John Stavropoulos on the evolution of ancient Greek culture to peplum pop culture in the mid 20th century to what Greek culture is like today and how that relates to the experience of live Greek people. And that was a really cool, really positive experience, even though I thought it was going to be way outside my wheelhouse as a guy who's kind of bad at ancient Greek. So yeah, I want to get into a couple of questions that I see over in the comments. So give me a second to read those. All right. Let me see. All right. What do you think is the best reason to bring in a culture consultation for a project? Yeah, I love this. Okay, great. I think the best reason to bring in a culture consultation for a project is that there's any kind of cultures or identities in the project at all. I think of all the possible reasons why you could want to get a cultural consultant, the best reason is that you think cultural design is important and you would like someone to check that over, no matter what your project is. When someone comes to me and they're like, I want a cultural consultant for this thing, and in that solicitation, I don't even know what or why they want the cultural consultant for it, in that, like, I'm not even let me state this another way. Many of my clients come to me at the 11th hour when something's already gone wrong, when there's already a problem in their work. Someone's already pointed out, hey, like, half of this book is actually built on this colonialist idea, and if we don't get a cultural consultant to fix it, then we're going to get in trouble. And when our cultural consultant does try to fix it, then we're going to have to rewrite half of this thing. That is the hardest situation for both me and the client to be in, because the work's already done, and for the most part, and we have to move heaven and earth to make those changes. It takes a huge amount of time and a huge amount of, like, effort and resources to get that done. And that's a much harder situation to be in than a client who comes to me at the beginning of a project when they don't even necessarily know what all the cultural stakes are, and they're just like, I'm in the outline phase, I'm in the first draft phase, and I want a cultural consultant to look at this right now just to make sure I'm not going in the wrong direction. Because in that moment when it's just like, there's no reason that there's no clear and present danger in the text. There's no giant threat that's already about to eat us. We're just bringing in a cultural consultant because it's a reasonable thing to do in anything and everything that has culture in it. That's when the work is easiest and cheapest for everybody involved. So that's my answer. Like, the best reason to bring in a cultural consultation is before you even know what the reason is, before you even know what the problem is, just because it's a good thing to do. The same way that words need editors, I think cultures and identities need consultants. And so that's, if you had to have me pick the best reason, not the most common, not the anything else, then I'd say that's my favorite reason. All right. So after that, we got any resources to check on how to get the point across to people who might not want to understand. All right. So we are living in a time of when there's like a renaissance of popular, like, social science books about how to talk to other people, about race and gender and age and ability and all that type of stuff. So if you look on the internet, if you check YouTube channels and you start watching, like, FD Signifier on YouTube, or that type of thing, there's already lots of awesome resources out there about how to do this. My personal favorite, in my opinion, like, the best video on the whole internet, and it's like sub 5 minutes, I think, is called How to Tell People They Sound Racist. It's by Jay Smooth. It's from like 20 years ago or something at this point. Yeah, less than 5 minutes, and it's a video which changed my life. So that's my personal favorite resource on this topic. I'm purposefully not going to tell you what it says, because I want you to go and find that and watch it yourself, because it's life-changing. So those are great. But in addition, I got a lot of stuff on my own website, jamesmendezhodes.com, and I specifically wrote a bunch of articles that were focused on exactly that topic, because I kept getting in certain conversations about certain topics. Like, I wrote the orc articles because people kept asking me about orcs. And so I did a bunch of research and went down a rabbit hole. And then eventually I realized, well, if I don't write this down, then I'm going to have to say it or copy it out a whole bunch of times. So let me just write an article and save a bunch of people a bunch of time. And that's often when people come and tell me, like, hey, your stuff's been useful to me. Very often it's been something like that. I got one up there called, for example, how to change your conversations about cultural appropriation, which is about, if you're trapped in like a Groundhog Day cycle of the same conversation about cultural appropriation over and over forever, then I have an article about different ways to have that conversation so that you can have a different conversation about that. I got a I got one about, like I mentioned earlier, the one on like how to play someone from another ethnicity. That one's up there. So there's a bunch of things on there which will get you started. And I hope that in your own cultural consulting conversations with your clients or your Thanksgiving conversations with that one uncle, those things are useful to you. But there's no resource that's going to be as reliably useful on a long term as having contact with people from other identities. So the two things that people always say when it comes to researching and representing cultures that aren't your own are do your research and talk to people from that group. And both of those things are really good advice, but they're also very difficult. And so doing research, you got to get good at doing research. You got to get good at discerning a good or a bad source, looking up the origins of certain sources, figuring out what kinds of identities, biases, attitudes, perspectives might be influencing a certain piece of work, and picking those apart for yourself, and then figuring out which of those ideas are actually going to be relevant to your client. So yeah, doing your research is a good idea, but doing research is a whole ass skill. Doesn't mean you shouldn't do it. Just be aware of how large and complex and interesting that problem is. Then the other thing is be in conversations with other people from other identities. So depending on where you are and what you're doing, in the world, geographically and in your life and so forth, it might not actually be very easy for you to meet people from a large diversity of other groups. I live in the greater New York metropolitan area. It's a little bit easier for me than for many other people, but something to be aware of just in life, not just in cultural consulting, but it's definitely relevant to cultural consulting, is if you don't know anybody from a certain demographic, then that's going to be a huge blank spot in your own experience, and you might want to think about how to change that. And I'm not talking about like implementing a quota system. To quote Hassan Minhaj, saying to yourself, I need some more black friends is a great thing to say. Saying I need exactly 2 more black friends is the plot of Get Out. So don't go out and try really hard to make those connections just because you need people to fill up a demographic hole in your life. But definitely do seek out voices from those blank spots in your own experience. And if you don't have access to people from a certain group, then look for literature, look for film, look for stuff in your local library, look for stuff on the internet that's own voices, stuff that people are saying to talk about themselves. Because one of the most important things to impart in terms of cultural representation is ideally you want to be representing a culture the way that culture represents itself. So this is not to say that you can't make up stuff that you can never tell any fictions or lies about a certain culture, but the lies other people tell about us are different from the lies we tell about ourselves. And that's a really, really important thing for cultural consultants to learn and to be able to teach their clients. Let's see. If you don't know where to start with a certain culture, one of my favorite places to start personally with my own poetry background is national epics and folklore. If you don't know anyone from a certain group, from a certain nation, find out what are some influential pieces of literature from way back in that nation's history, and learn about those, take time to read them. And if you're going to start anywhere, like great foundational works of literature that a nation wants everyone to read about that nation are often really important because they're the foundation of both positive representation and then also sometimes creepy and negative like nationalist things that you also need to be aware of. So yeah, I love national epics. I love folklore. It's a great place to start. Let's see. We got a question from Jack Rosetree. How do you make sure the things you consume were the product of culture consultation? I don't. Personally, I just kind of watch everything, and some of my favorite works didn't necessarily have cultural consultants. Like I always say that there's these two dating sim video games, Monster Prom and Monster Camp, which I consider to be like some of the greatest examples of cultural consultation that I've ever experienced, because they're deeply respectful of and uplifting of many, many different identities. And the game is also about genocide and cocaine and being horny on Maine. So it's simultaneously about both of those things, and I think it's really, really successful from many different cultural consulting perspectives. I don't know if they even had a cultural consultant, and so that's another thing. Like, it's okay to have problematic faves, even if you work in this industry, even if you work as a cultural consultant. Like, I started writing articles about orcs because orcs were my problematic fave. They're based on all types of racist and colonialist and regressive ideas, but also I think they're cool, and I like pretending to be them and pretending to hang out with them in role-playing games and so forth. So I have my problematic faves too, and it's okay to like that stuff. I just need to be able to think about orcs critically at the same time that I'm also enjoying them. And if I know that my friend has a certain kind of sensibility, or has a certain kind of sensitivity, I'm not gonna try to push that on them. So I don't think you have to make sure that the stuff you consume is the product of cultural consultation. It's easy to figure out if the stuff that you consume is Own Voices stuff. If the creator was a member of the group that they're talking about, that's easier to figure out. But whether or not something had a cultural consultant, I don't know how to do that with like most of the television I watch and most of the reads I book, most of the books I read. So I don't think you have to. I would love it if in 5 to 10 years we were all aware of that kind of stuff and people publish whether their stuff has been through a cultural consulting process. That would be great. But yeah, at this point, I don't think you have to. Cool. There was another question earlier that was longer. Background made me think about fusion cuisine. Could you talk about any experience about blending disparate cultures into a single game culture, or when two cultures engage or clash in a game where there's little real world analogs? Let's see, or few historical analogs of their interaction. Yeah. So in 2022, now, because of globalization, almost every culture has had some interactions with almost every other culture. And there might be fewer historical examples of that, but one thing that I always tell people when they're like, I want to make my medieval England or medieval Germany setting diverse, but I don't know how to do that. My first answer to that is always look much deeper and get deep into the history of that country and get deep into the history of diversity in that country, because you're always going to find that there's weird kinds of diversity that you totally did not expect. So very often you're going to find stuff about like Asian people who made trips to Greece and Rome in the 1600s or earlier than that, or interactions, real or even mythical, in between two different cultures. So if you keep looking, very often you will surprise yourself at how many interactions, or what few but notable interactions there have been between those different cultures. So if you haven't found them yet, look deeper. And if they really haven't interacted, then I would look at modern interactions between those two cultures and what those are like. So look at the things that are at stake in the modern interactions between those cultures. So, for example, let's look at the game with two dominant empires, one Ashkenazim and one Filipino. So, Mendez, that name is probably Sephardic Jewish. So we got a theory in my family that the Mendezes back in the 1400s were crypto-Sephardim in Spain who were like, we got to go oppress somebody else, or the Catholics here are going to keep oppressing us. And then they went to the Philippines to conquer the Philippines, while pretending to be or actually being converted to Roman Catholicism. So there's that historical interaction, which I found out about my own family, which I didn't find out until I was like talking to my cousins, and they were like, "Hey, you know where the name Mendez came from?" So there's that. And then in the present day, there's been an influx over the past like 20 to 50 years of Filipino workers in the Middle East in general and in Israel in particular. So there are times when in Israeli slang, the term Filipina has meant like any domestic worker. Like your Filipina doesn't actually even need to be Filipina. They can be from Somalia or wherever. So there's that modern day interaction. And so even if I'm writing about a historical period when like the Mendezes in Spain were coming to visit or conquer the Philippines, in addition to that like imperial pressure I got to be aware of, because my audience is present day, I also need to stay aware of the present day discourse about that same topic. So I have to look at what the experience of Filipinos working in Israel is going to be like, what kind of pressures and oppression that they face when they're working there and trying to send money home to the Philippines. And then I also got to look at the modern Jewish population who's in the Philippines and what their experiences are like in a country which is dominant majority Roman Catholic and where that Catholic pressure can be overwhelming. And it's most often directed in negative ways against Muslims in the Philippines, but it's also not easy for Jews. So you'd think that those two groups would have like little interaction outside of like me, my sister, and my three cousins, but there's way more there than you would originally expect if you start doing the research. So the two takeaways are: one, if you don't see it, look deeper, and two, if you don't find a historical analog, actually, even if you do find a historical analog, look at what's going on with it today. Another one from Scarlett. What's something you see a lot that you think someone should know before they turn to a cultural consultant? I used to have like a top 5, top 10 list of these, but I think the easiest way to sum up most of them is familiarize yourself with the most common and most pernicious racial stereotypes and the most broadly know what the most common harmful stereotypes are about any group that you're talking about, and know what kinds of pressures and dangers those groups face, first of all, because it'll make the cultural consultant's job easier if you've heard of it. So, for example, here are some ideas that you can do research on, which there's books and videos out about before you even talk to your cultural consultant. Orientalism, the idea of Europe creating an imaginary Middle East or Far East in their head for artistic purposes that has touchstones related to, but isn't the real Middle East. Look at the idea of the mythical norm. Audre Lorde's idea that there's a like generic or a normal person who is not like the real most common person in the world, but around whom a lot of our systems revolve, usually a cisgender, straight, able-bodied, white, Christian male. So familiarize yourself with like those kinds of terms, understand like the main kinds of dangers that a lot of people face, understand like what colonialism is, understand like what police violence is and like state-sponsored violence, how those things work. So familiarize yourself with like the biggest and most basic ideas that there's already lots of material out there about. And whether or not they come up in the cultural consulting process, having done those will make you a better person. Is there a specific difference between cultural consultants and sensitivity readers in games? So I started calling myself a cultural consultant because I thought it sounded cooler. Um, so sensitivity readers, when I first heard of them, were a thing that came up in like novels. So someone would write a novel and it would be almost done. And in the last stage of the manuscript, the publisher would bring in a sensitivity reader to read the manuscript and say if it offended any identities. And the problem with that process is, as I referenced earlier, the manuscript's basically done. So if you're like, hey, this main character is based on a racist idea and you got to completely change them, it's too late. So in addition to it making me feel cooler, I thought that the term cultural consultant implied that the process should start earlier in your creative timeline. So I don't know if that's working, but yeah, so calling myself a cultural consultant, I think encouraged people to bring me in earlier in the timeline. And I think it also highlights the creative aspect of it, because a sensitivity reader, that verb read isn't necessarily saying anything additive or constructive, right? Like, of course, sensitivity readers do a lot of brainstorming and they do a lot of creativity, but that term sensitivity reader doesn't really capture that creativity. So I thought cultural consultant, that felt more additive. Like a consultant like tells you stuff to do differently and then you do it. And so I wanted that implication to be in the title. I also don't love the use of the word sensitivity, because it's so often used as a pejorative, like, oh, you're so sensitive and that's your problem for being sensitive. And the problem isn't, like, if someone's racist, the problem isn't that I'm sensitive to racism. The problem is that they did racism. And that's not a problem because I'm sensitive. That's a problem because it causes harm. So taking the term sensitivity out of the conversation, I think recenters our attention on what I see to be like the main problem. Sen, you're muted.
Hey, here I am.
There, you're back.
Hey, everybody. So we
Yeah.
are coming up to the final couple minutes. And we have a question from Supine Arcanum. How did you get into this line of work? And Mr. or Mrs. Arcanum, or Supine Arcanum, whoever you are, James answered that way in detail at the beginning of this whole
Yeah.
video. So once it's closed, once the broadcast is ended, please go back and watch the first 5-10 minutes, and you'll find out all about how Mendez got into all this line of work, which is great.
By accident mostly.
Yeah,
Desperation.
you
Yeah.
kind of fell into
But
it.
yeah.
And
Tripped and
I
fell.
like the idea that you sort of created your own job title.
Yes.
And to me, it is my preferred title as well, because I also do this type of work from time to time. Because I also view it like you do, that
Mhm.
consultation should happen as part of the process, not as some rubber stamp at the end of the process.
Mhm.
And a consultant should have some value to their expertise that is why you pay us to follow
Mhm.
our expertise in some way.
Yeah.
And that if you're not doing that, I don't know why you're hiring us. Like
Mhm.
it's a strange thing
Yeah.
to hire me
Yeah.
as a cultural consultant and not listen to what I'm ostensibly an expert in. So yeah, I loved having your talk today, James. I think a lot of people out there in the tabletop mentorship program land are, really cluing into like, what is this? Why do we need to do this? When should we do this? And the answers that you gave today really, I think, cemented the idea of do it sooner than later. Do it because it needs to be done when you're working on anything that you're not it's not your voice or your culture that you're speaking for. And I think a lot of the resources that you provided through your own blog and the videos that you mentioned, I think those are going to be really helpful for a lot of people just to even go dip their toes in the well. There are a lot of people who may not agree with Mendez out there. We know them. They exist. But, I think there are a lot of people who do think about the cultures that they are impacting as they are trying to create something in a space that is supposed to be for entertainment. And it doesn't mean entertainment has to be always fun. It can be engaging and entertaining. It can be challenging and entertaining. Those are all valid. And I think that having a cultural consultant in the mix helps you to do that without harming or hurting people.
Definitely.
Or at
And
least
I think if you're ever like, you mentioned disagreement, and if I could leave you with one thing, not just as cultural consultants, just in general, it would be my website, which is jamesmendezhodes.com. If I could leave you with two things, it would be that when you're in a situation where you have different voices, where different people don't agree on how to approach a certain topic, as you break that down and you figure out what your own choices are there, look at who's talking and look at who has the most at stake. Look at who is most vulnerable. And I would encourage you, as your cultural consultant, to always look first at the person who has the most to lose in a given situation. Check the other voices also, but check that voice first.
Right. Great. Well, we're going to end the feed in a couple minutes, but I just wanted to leave you with who's coming up next. So we have Tatiana Quigley coming next week. Oh, not next, sorry, August 13th. So she will be here and she is going to be talking about the business of art. Tatiana has been an artist on many, many, many projects. She's worked with many, many companies up till the really high level companies. She'll tell you all about herself when she gets here, August 13th at 6 o'clock p.m. right here on the Tabletop Mentorship Program YouTube channel, and she's going to be talking about the business of art. So art from both sides of the fences. Later on, August 27th, we have Heather O'Neill coming to talk about making RPGs on the cheap, zines, itch.io, all that kind of stuff. We have Carrie Rendell McIver from Panda GM coming on September 3rd, and she will be talking about designing with manufacturing in mind and or eco-conscious manufacturing. I'm sure if you ask her any questions about either of those things, she'll be spot on. And then we have Reynalyn Medina coming from 1 Minute Board Games. She is going to talk about pitching your services as a content creator to all sorts of people, RPG publishers, board game publishers, etc., etc. And then the last one isn't locked down yet. So Mendez, maybe if you can poke Gian about this. We're hoping to get Gian Shim here in October 1st, to talk about all of her weird niches that she's into, big games and all that kind of stuff. So we will see you
how to skin and clean animals.
Or forage for mushrooms.
Yeah.
Those are the best talks, by the way, is when Gian starts talking about that, and then like Daniel Kwan might start bringing out knives.
Yeah.
They're always fun talks. It's great to see everybody here. Thank you for coming. We're going to leave you on that note, and we will see you very shortly. Bye, everybody. Bye,
Peace.
James. Thanks very much for talking. See ya.